Hey, this is Mike Robbins. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. I hope you're doing well, you, your family, your team, everyone around you. As I'm recording this, we're rolling into February. My 51st birthday is a couple days from today, so I'm thinking about that and in a bit of a reflective mood. I want to talk about something that has been pretty widely discussed in recent weeks and months in sort of a political context, but it seems to be having an impact socially as well as organizationally. And it's definitely been coming up in lots of discussions and conversations I've been having with our clients. Now, you may be listening to or watching this right in early February when I'm recording this and posting it, or you may be listening to or watching this quite a bit later. But there's been a lot of discussion about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I feel like there's been some things missing from the conversation, and I've been pretty disheartened, to be honest, listening to it discussed in the media. Um, and as somebody who grew up where I grew up and how I grew up in Oakland, got my degree in American Studies with a specialization in race and ethnicity, and has been doing my work for the last 24 years. In recent years, and I've talked a lot about it here on the show, I started to write and speak more directly about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in my work. And for many years, I shied away from that, not because I didn't have things to say about it or was overtly too scared to talk about it, although there definitely was some fear. I just sort of felt like, I'm a white guy, who wants to hear me talk about diversity and inclusion? But over the last decade or so, um, it's just become not that it wasn't important before that. It's just we're talking about it more in society. We're talking about it more at work, thankfully. And there still are so many issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that need to be addressed, so many challenges. But I think the way that it's being discussed and debated politically and in the media is somehow, to me, just missing the point in a lot of ways. This notion that people are DEI hires, like, they're getting uh, hired simply because of how they look and not because of who they are or their qualifications. Now, look, I'll be the first to admit I'm not involved in hiring decisions. And with all of the HR teams that I partner with and all of the chief people officers and senior leaders in HR, as well as, executives and leaders of all kinds, while I do talk to them about hiring and the importance of hiring well, and a number of our clients definitely have had initiatives over the years of wanting their workforce to look a little more like their customer base or like the country or the world in which they operate. Um, I don't sit in those meetings. I'm not behind closed doors listening to the discussions for how that actually goes down. So I don't really know. I mean, look, there's a lot of data out there that tells us and stuff that I've looked at for years. McKinsey puts out reports every year on delivering through diversity. And a recent one I saw said that, culturally diverse teams outperform non-culturally diverse teams by like 33%, and gender diverse teams outperform non-gender diverse teams by 21%. So in terms of bottom line results, having a diverse team matters. Now, how we go about filling the pipeline for who we interview and who we ultimately hire, I don't know. And is it an imperfect system? I would imagine it is, just like college admissions. And with all the attempts over many, many years trying to figure out a way to be as equitable and as fair as possible, it's still unfair, right? If you know a guy who knows a guy or a woman who knows someone, or you were connected with someone and went to school with them, or, you know, your resume is going to probably go up to the top of the list. Like that's how life works. That's how business works. Relationships matter. Where we come from, what we did before, where we went to school, where we worked before, where we grew up, those things matter just on a human level. And yeah, there's some bias. And yeah, there can sometimes be a sort of good old boy network, as we call it, that can be nefarious or problematic. And sometimes it's simply just like, who do I know? Who have I worked with before? Who do I relate to? So again, in my book, We're All in This Together, one of the four pillars is to focus on inclusion and belonging. And one of the things that I lay out in the book, and it's super simple, but I just want to talk about it, is like diversity has to do with like the makeup of our teams and our organizations, right? Inclusion has to do with, do people who are in positions of privilege or authority or power do a good job of inviting in those people who might not be in those positions of privilege and authority, or in the dominant group, whatever the dominant group may be for that particular team or organization. And then belonging has to do with, how does everyone on the team, how do all the individuals on the team, how do they feel in terms of their sense of really belonging and being part of the team and the organization? And much of my work focuses on inclusion and belonging. And in this whole conversation around DEI, what seems to be getting lost is like, wait, what about the inclusion part? What about the belonging part? What about the, right? And, again, just to talk a bit about the hiring piece, I saw something online a couple days ago that I just want to read, because to me, in an ideal world, what DEI is intended to do with respect to hiring is this. So this was posted by someone who said, as someone who works closely with HR professionals, I find it disheartening, but not entirely surprising, to see some level of misunderstanding in some of the responses and conversations about DE&I. They go on to say, let me clarify, DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not about enforcing quotas. It's about ensuring that everyone who meets the qualifications for a job has a fair and equitable opportunity to interview, and ultimately is selected based on merit, not factors like race or gender. We all have a natural tendency to gravitate towards people who are similar to us, but a fair and unbiased interview process, one that considers candidates both similar to and different from ourselves, helps organizations identify and hire the best talent. Sometimes the best candidate might look like you, and sometimes they might not. Here's the bottom line. Countless studies have demonstrated that DE&I initiatives benefit companies. A workforce enriched by diverse experiences and perspectives drives innovation and fosters growth, making businesses stronger and more successful. And when I read this, like, that resonated with me. And look, again, is it perfect? No. Are there situations when there's bias one way or the other, or something's unfair, or hey, we need more people who look like this on this team, or as part of this event, or as part of this project, or for this thing we're doing? And absolutely, I'm sure that that happens on every which way. And at the same time, has it happened for generations and generations that people who maybe weren't the most qualified, or just because they were friends with someone or knew someone, or their, parents owned the company, whatever it is, there's so many factors that make things unfair. Trying to make things more equitable, I think, is a good intention. Continuing to figure out how we do that in the most effective way is messy, is imperfect. I don't have the answer to it, but I think making sure that we have as many people as possible in the pipeline for jobs, to me, creates the most competition, the best outcomes, and ideally makes it so the best qualified people ultimately end up in the various positions, whether it's in the government or in big corporations or nonprofit organizations or small businesses or whatever. And look, if you run a business of your own, you get to decide who you hire and what you do. The bigger it becomes, the more it has to do with the public, like, I don't know, the government, but especially big companies. From my perspective, it's like having a workforce that's representative of the customers that you serve or the people in your community is probably good for everybody involved. That said, what we're not talking a lot about in this discussion around DEI is all of the initiatives that I see inside of organizations focused on inclusion, focused on belonging, focused on creating environments where people feel safe, where people can bring their whole selves to work, where people feel like they can show up and express themselves. And those are so important. I mean, a lot of times I get brought in by the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I get brought in to work on some of these initiatives. What can we do to empower and inspire our leaders so that they're asking the right questions, so that they're communicating in a way that's inclusive, so that they're understanding both cultural differences, but just different generations and what's happening for people and how people are navigating the hybrid working, growth uncertainty of today, multi-generations in the workforce, so many things that are really important. And a number of years ago, I had Eric Severson on this podcast. I think I've had him on twice. And Eric and I met when he was the co-CHRO of Gap Inc. He went on to be the chief people officer at DaVita and then at Neiman Marcus, and has since stepped away from that and is actually starting his own business as a consultant, as a coach, which I'm excited about because he's one of the wisest people I know, both about business and about life. And we had a really interesting conversation several years ago that impacted me significantly in this regard. I was actually working on my book, We're All in This Together. And Eric is male. He is white and happens to be a member of the LGBTQ community. And we were having a conversation about diversity and inclusion. And Eric said something simple but profound. And I've quoted him here on the show a few times. I quoted him in We're All in This Together because it really impacted me. He said, Mike, if you ask most of us, he's like, look, I can't speak on behalf of everybody who identifies as being part of one or more non-dominant groups. But he's like, I myself, as a member of the LGBTQ community and someone who has spent a lot of my career focused on diversity and inclusion, I've talked to lots of people about this. I said, if you ask most of us if we'd rather be included than excluded, I think most of us would say, yeah, I'd rather be included than excluded. He said, but the premise of that is such that there's an in-group that has to grant power to the out-group, right? And he's like, look, I live in the real world. That exists in most organizations. That exists in most societies. He goes, but that still sets up that unequal power dynamic. And he said, well, I want to be as inclusive as possible, and I want people around me to be as inclusive as possible. And I talk to my leaders about being as inclusive as possible. I think really what most of us want is just to know that we belong here. And that belonging, as Eric and I talked about that day when I interviewed him, is one of our fundamental needs as human beings. When you think of Maslow's hierarchy, right? There's physiological needs, there's safety needs, and then the third level of the five is both social connection and belonging, knowing that we're part of something, we're part of a group where we belong. And then it, moves along to esteeming needs and ultimately to self-actualization, which is the top of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy. But look, regardless of your race and your gender and your age and your orientation and your background and your socioeconomic status or, physical abilities, religious preference, or no religion at all, as human beings, we have a fundamental need to belong. And you, like me, have probably had some experiences in your life where you felt like you belonged. And currently, you probably have some of those as well. And you also have probably had some experiences where you felt like you didn't belong. And yeah, maybe some of that, depending on our race and our gender and our orientation and our socioeconomic background or our age or where we grew up or our religious preference or any of those identity pieces, that may have contributed to not feeling like we belonged in a certain situation. But even if you're in the quote dominant group along all those lines, right? I'm a 50-year-old heterosexual white male in America. I'm in a lot of dominant groups. I'm in the majority or in positions of privilege or power often. And I've still had lots of experience in my life where I felt like I didn't belong. So it's universal. And ultimately, when we think about work or we think about our teams or our groups, what are we doing to foster an environment of inclusion and ultimately belonging? And look, I know some people can get really uncomfortable when we're talking so much about race and gender and orientation and background and identity and all of these things. Like that makes some people uncomfortable. But let's be honest, usually it's white people, at least here in America, that are uncomfortable with the conversation around race. Usually it's men that are uncomfortable with the conversation around gender. And again, it's not to say that we can't be mindful of people's level of comfort. But I think what's happened over the last decade is that these conversations are so important, but the way that we've been having them, the way they've been facilitated, the way that they get picked up in the culture, if you will, on social media, they've gotten to me to be very, I think they're important, but I think they get reduced to posts and tweets and sound bites and phrases. And then the phrases, even DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, like how that's been weaponized and sort of turned into a pejorative, I have no idea. Unless you really don't want diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think a lot of us do. Again, if you want the best team possible, having a diverse team is important. If you want people with different skill sets and backgrounds and mindsets and perspectives, and which I know from studying high performing teams for almost 25 years is essential. Even if all those people happen to look the same, you want a diversity of skill sets and backgrounds and perspectives, absolutely. And the more that the people don't look the same, the more likely those differences and diversities are going to be there. Equitability is just about things being fair and access. And then inclusion, again, I think most of us would rather be included than not included. And ultimately, to me, the goal is to create an environment where people really feel like they belong. And look, I do understand that constantly having conversations about inequity and racism and sexism and homophobia, to some of us, if we don't experience those things on a daily basis, or that's not our lived reality, can seem hyperbolic at times, or can seem annoying at times, or can seem, you know, guilt or shame inducing at times. I get that. I remember way, way back when I was in junior high school, Montera Junior High School in Oakland, California. I was in eighth grade and I was in leadership in the junior high school, and we were having a whole conversation. And there were a group of African American students at our school who were adamant about wanting to have a Black Student Union, a BSU. We want a BSU. We want a BSU. You know, and I was what, 13, 14 years old. And the school was very diverse. You know, probably the same number of white kids as Black kids, roughly, quite a few Asian and Latino kids. I mean, Oakland's a really diverse place. You know, and by the time I got to high school, you know, my high school graduating class had like 18% white kids. And there were way more African Americans and Asian Americans and Latino Americans in my high school than white kids. And I just say that for context, but I remember thinking at the time, not really understanding. And to me, the dominant culture in our middle school was a lot of the kids who were advocating for the Black Student Union. And it took me a minute, even at that age, to really understand the larger context of why that was important. Or even studying Black History Month as we celebrate it here in February, the importance of that, and wanting to be both uneducated and then have that representation and have that prioritization of it. Again, these are really hard conversations to have and tricky subjects to discuss for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. I don't know what it's like to be anything but me, my lived experience. And when we start talking about race and we start talking about gender and we start talking about orientation and we start talking about some of these very personal things, it can get tricky. It can get emotional. People start throwing around judgments and opinions in a very self-righteous way. And my hope is that we can have more authentic conversations about this stuff. We cannot be so afraid to talk about these topics, and at the same time can really show up with a genuine sense of authenticity, which, you know, I talk about authenticity a lot. What's authenticity? It's honesty without self-righteousness and with vulnerability. So not removing our opinion, not removing our passion, not removing our strong belief or values, but removing the arrogance that says just because I think it makes it true with a capital T. And then adding that sense of vulnerability, which says, I don't have all the answers. I don't know exactly how this works. I'm not 100% sure at times. This feels scary to me or uncomfortable to me, or I have really strong opinions and beliefs about this, or this has been my lived experience. I don't understand how other people can't see it this way. And ultimately, in this whole conversation around DEI, can we really talk about, yes, absolutely is an important conversation to have about hiring, about equity, about representation, about what that means. And on one side of that argument is people thinking this isn't fair and these are quotas and people are getting access when they don't deserve it. And on the other side is saying, wait a minute, we're talking about not everybody starts at the same place. We're talking about putting people into the pipeline to be considered for jobs that a generation or two ago, maybe they weren't even considered for. Let's try to figure out how we open it up to the most people possible and make it as fair and equitable as we can, knowing full well it's never going to be completely fair. Hiring is subjective. The person hiring gets to decide who they want for the job. And, there's a lot of different pressures on that in a lot of different directions. But that piece of hiring, of people being qualified for certain jobs, has to do with the individual and the human being and their background and their experience. But there's a whole other world of really focusing as individuals, as leaders, as teams, as organizations, as human beings, like, how do we create environments that are inclusive? How do we focus on, as best as we can, making sure people genuinely feel like they belong, irrespective of what they think or where they come from or how they pray or not, or what they believe in, or what they look like, or how old they are, all the different things. And again, the reality is I could get a group of 10 other people who look exactly like me, and there's no guarantee that we're going to create an environment that's inclusive and we all have a sense of belonging. That takes work, that takes intention, that takes focus. So what can you do in your real life? Not posting on social media about it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but not just sort of pontificating about it, but in your real life. Can you reach out to the real people around you? In your family, in your community, on your team, in your company. People that maybe, if you happen to be in a position of some kind of authority, of some kind of privilege, of some kind of something, and look, all of us are to some degree. You don't have to be the CEO of a company to be in some kind of privileged position, or be able to invite someone in who may feel, or you may sense they don't necessarily feel included. Are you checking in with people? Are you asking people questions and being curious about their experience? That's how we start to embody inclusion. And then ultimately belonging is sort of taking that an even deeper step, if you will, and really connecting on a human level and doing whatever we can to create that sense of belonging, to create that sense of we're in it together. And again, some of you may be listening or watching this and think, well, how can I do that? I'm not in charge here. I'm not making the rules. You don't have to be the one making the rules to really focus on inclusion and belonging. It's a mindset. It's a perspective. It's an intention. It's about how we operate, how we go about doing the things that we do. It's not necessarily about rules per se. And there might be certain agreements that we make collectively within certain groups and certain teams and certain organizations, about policies, about language, about certain things that are more inclusive. I think sometimes we get hung up on words and phrases, and not that words don't matter. They do. Language matters. But growing up where I grew up and how I grew up and in my own house, my sister Lori was like the word police often, but she was constantly coaching me on certain words and paying attention to the things that I was saying and reminding me and pointing out, hey, if you use that word or that phrase or refer to it that way, that can actually be offensive to someone. That can have someone put up a defense against you. And if that's not what you want, then maybe find a different word or a different phrase or a different way to talk about that. And at the same time, I think, again, do words matter? Yes. Do actions matter? Yes. Does impact matter? Yes. And intention matters too. It doesn't matter completely. If my intention is not to hurt your feelings, but I do or say something that hurts your feelings, both things can be true at the same time. So a lot of this also on a human level comes down to our emotional intelligence, self-awareness and self-management, one side of emotional intelligence, social awareness and relationship management, another side of it. Look, I think this whole thing that's been happening as of late can make us afraid to talk about things, make us afraid to not want to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, make us afraid if we feel like, depending on who we are and how we look and the identity or identities that we have, maybe we feel less safe and under attack. Maybe we feel more walking on eggshells. I get it. We're in the midst of a cultural moment that's challenging and tricky on lots of levels. My hope is that we lean into it. My hope is that we have the courage to really lower the waterline on the iceberg and be real about it, be real about how we feel, ask real questions, engage in real conversations, not shy away from some of these difficult topics around diversity, but ultimately focus our attention on inclusion and belonging, which I think is what everyone wants. And no matter what we call it, no matter what the terminology is or the phrase or even what the policies are, like people want to work in environments where there's a sense of inclusion and belonging. That's what we want. That's what teamwork is about. That's what culture is about. So whatever your role is, whatever you happen to do, the more you can focus on inclusion and belonging, the better it's going to be for you, the people around you, and your team. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Make sure to hit the follow or the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. There's some links in the show notes and down below here on YouTube if you're watching the video, where you can connect with me on some of the social media platforms, as well as learn more about me and my work. Best place to do that is at our website, which is mike-robbins.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Keep bringing your whole self to work and to life, even if it feels scary or uncomfortable to do that at times. And remember, we're all in this thing together.